My name is Margaret Walker. I am 70 years old. On Tuesday afternoons I polish the silver and decide which pie to bring to my daughter's house. That was what I did 3 weeks ago, when my phone lit up with a text from Rachel Doyle, my attorney of nearly 3 decades. 3 weeks earlier, the screen glowed white. I set down the polish cloth. My hands didn't shake. They just stopped moving. Rachel never texted, only calls, only emergencies. Call me, right now. The words sat there, cold, final. I called. Rachel didn't say hello. She said, "Margaret, are you alone?" I said yes. She said good. Then came the rest. Electronic filing. Downtown Boston firm. Conservatorship. Linda Cooper. Rachel's voice, flat, clinical. She said, "They're petitioning for your full medical and financial records." She said, "Margaret, they're trying to have you declared legally incapacitated." The kitchen went quiet. Sunlight still came through the window. The blueberry pie still sat on the counter. The photograph of Robert still hung on the wall. 5 years gone. Still watching. I said, "I'm still going to dinner." I said, "If she is going to lie about me, I will look at her while she does it." Rachel hissed through the phone. She said, "Don't drink anything. Don't sign anything. Don't argue. Be a witness. Then come straight to me." I put the good pie back. The one I'd made. Store-bought would do fine now. I took the store-bought one instead. If I was walking into a performance, they didn't deserve homemade. Linda's house in Portsmouth was too big. Too bright. Exactly the kind of place a real estate agent buys when she believes commissions will never slow down. Mark, my son-in-law, opened the door before I rang. He said, "We've been worried." He said, "You made it." His voice carried the tone of someone practicing lines. Inside smelled of rosemary chicken and desperation. Linda came out of the kitchen in an apron that had never met grease. At 44 she was beautiful. Like I was at 30. But her eyes were hard. Measuring. Transactional. She hugged me lightly. She said, "Mom, how are you feeling?" She said, "You've seemed so tired lately." I wasn't tired. I was 70. There's a difference. Dinner was theater. Mark carved the chicken with surgical precision. Linda poured water, not wine. She asked about my week. She asked if I'd been sleeping. She asked if I'd been forgetting things. Each question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spreading. Evidence gathering. I answered in facts. I said I slept 7 hours last night. I said I balanced my checkbook yesterday. I said I drove to the grocery store, bought produce, paid with exact change. Every answer a brick in my own defense. Linda smiled. Thin. Tight. She said, "We just want to make sure you're safe." She said, "We worry about you in that big house." She said, "At your age, things can get overwhelming." At your age. As if 70 were the same as senile. Mark refilled my water glass. He said, "We've been talking." He said, "Maybe it's time to simplify." He said, "We found a lovely community. Assisted living. Beautiful grounds. Activities. People your own age." I looked at Linda. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She was looking at the chicken. At the table. At the imaginary future where my house became hers. And my accounts funded her next renovation. I said, "I'm not interested." I said, "I'm perfectly capable of living alone." I said, "Robert and I bought that house in 1978. I said, "I'm not leaving it." Linda's face changed. The performance cracked. She said, "Mom, you're not being realistic." She said, "Dad's been gone 5 years." She said, "It's too much house for one person." She said, "You're making poor decisions." I asked what poor decisions. She said you gave $15,000 to some door-to-door charity. She said you don't even remember doing it. I remembered perfectly. The charity was real. Veterans Housing Fund. I'd researched it. I'd written the check with full knowledge and intent. But Linda had made it sound like dementia. Like confusion. Like evidence. I said it was a loan. I said I have the paperwork. I said Mark made the door. You made it. Linda's voice went cold. She said we're trying to help you. She said you're being stubborn. She said we have a responsibility. Responsibility. The word people use when they mean control. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. Loud. Final. I said thank you for dinner. I said I need to go home now. I said I have an appointment tomorrow morning. Mark stood too. He said let me drive you. I said no. I said I drove here. I will drive home. Linda followed me to the door. She said Mom, please. She said we love you. She said this is for your own good. For your own good. The second most dangerous phrase in the English language. Right after trust me. I drove home in silence. The highway stretched out dark and empty. My hands on the wheel. Steady. Capable. 70 years old and still driving at night. Still living alone. Still making my own decisions. The conservatorship papers would come soon. Rachel had warned me. Legal threats wrapped in concern. My daughter's signature at the bottom. But I wasn't confused. I wasn't incapacitated. I was a 70-year-old woman standing in her own kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon. And someone was trying to take that away. They picked the wrong woman. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Rachel's office was on the third floor of a brick building near Faneuil Hall. Wednesday morning, 9 o'clock sharp. The elevator hummed upward. My reflection stared back from the steel doors. 70 years old. Gray hair pulled back. Navy cardigan. Pearl earrings Robert gave me on our 40th anniversary. I looked like someone's grandmother. That was the problem. That was exactly what Linda was counting on. The doors opened. Rachel stood waiting in the hallway. She didn't smile. She said come in. She said we need to talk fast. Her office smelled of coffee and old law books. Papers covered the desk. Legal pads. Yellow highlighter marks everywhere. She'd been working all night. The evidence was in the coffee cups. 3 of them. All empty. Rachel sat down. She slid a folder across the desk. She said this is what they filed. She said read it carefully. She said every word matters now. The petition was 18 pages long. Legal language. Cold. Clinical. But the story underneath was clear. Margaret Walker, age 70, widow, living alone. Declining mental capacity. Poor judgment. Financial mismanagement. Unable to care for herself. Requires immediate intervention for her own protection. My daughter's signature sat at the bottom. Neat. Careful. The same signature she'd practiced in high school. Dotting the I in Linda with a little heart. Rachel said they're moving fast. She said the hearing is in 2 weeks. She said Judge Morrison is assigned to the case. She said he's tough but fair. She said we need to prove you're completely competent. Completely. As if competence came in degrees. As if being 70 meant starting from a deficit. I asked what evidence they have. Rachel turned pages. She said they're claiming memory issues. She said they have statements from neighbors. She said Mrs. Chen reported you left your car running in the driveway for 20 minutes last month. I remembered that day. February 14th. I'd been warming up the car. Defrosting the windshield. It was 12 degrees outside. 20 minutes was necessary, not negligent. Rachel continued. She said they're questioning the $15,000 donation. She said they're calling it impulsive and irrational. She said they have bank records showing unusual spending patterns. Unusual. I'd bought a new refrigerator. The old one was 30 years old. I'd replaced the furnace. I'd donated to 3 legitimate charities. None of this was irrational. All of it was documented. But documentation didn't matter when the narrative was already written. Elderly woman. Living alone. Making poor choices. The story sold itself. Rachel leaned forward. She said, Margaret, I need to ask you something. She said, have you been forgetting things? She said, any confusion? Any moments where you felt lost? The question hung there. Heavy. Important. I said no. I said I remember everything. I said I know what day it is. I said I know where I am. I said I manage my own bills, my own medications, my own life. Rachel nodded. She said good. She said that's what I thought. She said but we need to prove it. She said they'll bring a psychiatrist. She said we need to bring evidence. She said we need witnesses who can testify to your competence. Windows. That's what we needed. People who could see into my life and report what they saw. The problem was I'd been living quietly. Independently. Exactly the way capable people do. Rachel started making a list. She said we need your doctor. She said we need financial records. She said we need character witnesses. She said anyone who can speak to your mental state. I thought of my neighbors. Mrs. Chen, who'd apparently been watching my driveway. Mr. Patterson 2 doors down. The couple across the street whose names I never learned. People observed. They rarely testified. Rachel said what about friends? She said book club. She said church groups. She said volunteer work. I said I stopped volunteering after Robert died. I said the book club dissolved 3 years ago. I said I go to church on Christmas and Easter. I said I live alone because I choose to live alone. I said that doesn't make me incompetent. Silence filled the office. Outside, traffic sounds drifted up from the street. Car horns. Sirens. The city moving forward while my life was being picked apart by lawyers. Rachel closed the folder. She said, Margaret, I'm going to be honest with you. She said conservatorship cases are hard to fight. She said judges tend to err on the side of caution. She said they'd rather protect someone who doesn't need protection than risk someone who does. I understood what she wasn't saying. The system was designed to take power away. Especially from old women. Especially from women who lived alone and made their own choices. I asked what happens if we lose. Rachel's face went still. She said Linda becomes your conservator. She said she controls your finances. She said she makes medical decisions. She said she can decide where you live. She said you lose legal autonomy. Legal autonomy. A fancy term for freedom. I said so I become a child again. I said my daughter gets to decide if I can buy a car. I said she gets to decide if I can see a doctor. I said she gets to put me in a home. Rachel said yes. She said essentially, yes. The room felt smaller. The walls closer. This was what drowning felt like. Slow. Legal. Wrapped in concern and pretty words. I stood up. The chair scraped backward. I said then we don't lose. I said tell me what you need. I said I'll get it. Rachel looked up at me. Something shifted in her expression. Recognition maybe. Or respect. She said we start with your doctor. She said we get a full cognitive evaluation. She said we document everything. She said every bill paid on time. She said every appointment kept. She said every decision made with clear intent. I said when do we start? Rachel said now. She said right now. I walked out of that office with a list of tasks. Medical appointments. Financial audits. Character references. A paper trail of competence to fight a paper trail of decline. The elevator descended. My reflection stared back again. Same gray hair. Same navy cardigan. But something had shifted. The performance was over. Now came the work. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Dr. Patricia Chen had been my physician for 12 years. Thursday morning, 10:15. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and old magazines. A child coughed somewhere behind me. The receptionist typed steadily. Keys clicking. Rhythmic. Mechanical. Rachel had called ahead. She'd explained what we needed. A full cognitive assessment. Documentation of mental competence. A letter for the court. Dr. Chen had agreed immediately. She'd said come in tomorrow. She'd said we'll handle this. My name echoed across the waiting room. A nurse stood in the doorway. Clipboard in hand. She smiled the professional smile medical staff practice. She said follow me please. She said we'll start with vitals. Blood pressure, temperature, weight, pulse. The routine measurements of a body still functioning. 118/76. 98.4. 132 pounds. 68 beats per minute. All normal. All exactly what they should be. Dr. Chen entered the exam room. She was 52. Precise. Efficient. She'd delivered Linda 44 years ago. She'd held my hand when Robert had his first heart attack. She'd signed his death certificate 5 years later. She said Margaret. She said I heard what's happening. She said let's make sure we document everything properly. The cognitive assessment took 45 minutes. She asked me to remember 3 words. Apple. Table. Penny. She asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. She asked me to draw a clock showing 3:30. She asked me what year it was. What month. What day. Who was president. Every answer came easily. Automatic. 2025. November. Thursday. Donald Trump. Apple. Table. Penny. Dr. Chen made notes. Steady. Thorough. She said your cognition is perfect. She said your memory is sharp. She said there's no evidence of decline. She said I'll write that in my letter. I asked if perfect was enough. Dr. Chen looked up from her notes. She said Margaret, you're 70 years old. She said you're healthier than most 50-year-olds I see. She said you manage a household independently. She said you drive. She said you handle complex financial decisions. She said anyone questioning your competence isn't looking at medical evidence. Medical evidence. The phrase felt important. Solid. Something a judge might believe. She asked if I'd been sleeping. I said 7 hours a night. She asked about appetite. I said normal. She asked about mood. I said stable. She asked if I'd been feeling confused or forgetful. I said no. I said never. The examination continued. Reflexes. Vision. Hearing. Motor skills. Everything measured. Everything documented. Everything normal for a woman my age. Dr. Chen finished writing. She said I'll have this letter ready by tomorrow. She said it will state clearly that you have full mental capacity. She said you're capable of making your own decisions. She said there's no medical justification for conservatorship. I thanked her. She touched my arm. Brief. Warm. She said Margaret, I've known you for 12 years. She said I delivered your daughter. She said this isn't about your health. She said you know that. I said I know. She said good. She said then let's make sure the court knows it too. The pharmacy was next on Rachel's list. Documentation of medication management. Proof I could handle my own prescriptions. The store was 3 blocks from Dr. Chen's office. Fluorescent lights. Tile floors. Aisles of products nobody really needed. The pharmacist was young. Maybe 30. She looked up my records. She said, Mrs. Walker. She said you've been filling prescriptions here for 8 years. She said always on time. She said never any issues. I asked if she could write that down. She looked confused. I explained about the hearing. About the conservatorship petition. About needing proof of competence. Her expression changed. Something like anger. She said they're questioning whether you can manage your own medications. I said yes. She said that's ridiculous. She said you're more reliable than half my patients. She printed out my medication history. 8 years of records. Blood pressure medication. Cholesterol medication. A thyroid supplement. Every refill on schedule. Every instruction followed exactly. Perfect compliance. That's what the medical term was. She said I'll write a statement. She said I'll say you're fully capable. She said this is wrong. Wrong. The word followed me out of the pharmacy. Into the parking lot. Into my car. This whole thing was wrong. But wrong didn't matter in court. Evidence mattered. Documentation mattered. The bank was my next stop. Thursday afternoon. 1 o'clock. Rachel had said we needed financial records. Proof of sound money management. The branch manager was expecting me. His name was David Torres. 40 years old. Neat suit. Firm handshake. He said, Mrs. Walker. He said I pulled your account history. He said let's go through this together. His office was small. Organized. A photograph of 2 children sat on his desk. Both smiling. Both under 10. He spread out printouts. 6 months of bank statements. Every transaction visible. Every decision documented. David pointed to the numbers. He said your checking account is managed perfectly. He said bills paid on schedule. He said no overdrafts. He said no unusual activity. He said the $15,000 donation shows as a single check. He said written to a registered nonprofit. He said completely legitimate. I asked about the spending patterns Linda mentioned. David frowned. He said there's nothing unusual here. He said you bought a refrigerator in January. He said you paid a contractor in February. He said you made charitable donations. He said all normal expenditures for a homeowner. He said would you like me to write a letter? I said yes. I said please. David leaned back in his chair. He said Mrs. Walker, I've handled accounts for 20 years. He said I've seen financial mismanagement. He said I've seen confusion. He said I've seen people who need help. He said you're not one of them. The words settled into the quiet office. Outside, someone laughed. Footsteps echoed on tile. Normal bank sounds. Normal Thursday afternoon. David said I'll have this letter ready tomorrow. He said it will state clearly that you demonstrate sound financial judgment. He said there's no evidence of impairment or mismanagement. I collected the documents. 3 folders now. Medical evaluation. Pharmacy records. Bank statements. Paper proof of a competent life. Evidence that I was exactly who I'd always been. The car sat in the parking lot. Engine off. Windows up. I looked at the folders on the passenger seat. 45 minutes of cognitive tests. 8 years of prescription history. 6 months of bank records. This was what my life had become. A collection of documents proving I deserved to keep living it. The sun moved behind clouds. Shadows shifted across the dashboard. Thursday afternoon fading toward evening. Tomorrow was Friday. The hearing was 11 days away. 11 days to build a defense against my own daughter. I started the car. The engine caught immediately. Reliable. Functional. Like everything else in my carefully managed life. Time to go home. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Friday morning arrived cold and gray. 6:30. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen. Steam rose from the cup. Black. No sugar. The same way I'd been drinking it for 50 years. Rachel needed character witnesses. People who could testify to my competence. The problem was that competent people lived quietly. They didn't need witnesses to their daily lives. I made a list at the kitchen table. Names, addresses, phone numbers. People who'd seen me living my ordinary, capable life. Father Michael at St. Anne's. I'd attended Christmas and Easter services for 43 years. Not devout. Just consistent. He would remember me. Susan Park at the library. I'd volunteered there until Robert died. Shelving books. Organizing donations. 5 years ago now. But Susan had a good memory. Tom Bradley. Our accountant for 30 years. He filed our taxes every April. He'd seen every financial decision Robert and I had made. He knew the numbers. He knew we'd been careful. The list grew slowly. Each name felt thin, insufficient. These were people who'd observed me, not people who knew me. There was a difference. The phone sat on the table. Silent, waiting. I started with Father Michael. His voice was warm when he answered. He said, "Margaret." He said, "It's been too long." He said, "How can I help you?" I explained the situation, the petition, the hearing, the need for testimony. My voice stayed level, factual, just the information he needed. Father Michael was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret, I've known you since 1982. He said you and Robert never missed a Christmas service. He said after Robert passed, you kept coming. He said you're one of the most capable people I know." I asked if he would testify. He said of course. He said absolutely. He said this is wrong. That word again. Wrong. But wrong needed witnesses. Susan Park answered on the third ring. Her voice was older than I remembered. She said, "Margaret Walker." She said, "I haven't heard from you in years." I told her why I was calling. The conservatorship. The court hearing. The need for people who could speak to my character. My competence. Susan made a small sound. Surprise maybe. Or anger. She said, "Your daughter is doing this." I said yes. Susan said, "Well, that's something." She said, "Margaret, you volunteered at the library for 12 years. She said you were always on time. She said you never made mistakes. She said you handled our entire donation system. She said you were more organized than most of our paid staff." I asked if she would write a letter for the court. Susan said, "I'll do better than that." She said, "I'll come testify." She said, "I'll tell them exactly what I just told you. 2 witnesses. Not enough yet, but something." Tom Bradley's secretary put me through immediately. Tom was 75 now. Retired technically, but still doing taxes for old clients. He said, "Margaret." He said, "I heard something about a legal matter." He said, "Rachel Doyle called me yesterday." Rachel was working ahead of me, building the case while I made phone calls. Smart. Efficient. Exactly what I was paying her for. Tom said, "I pulled your tax records." He said, "I've been filing for you and Robert since 1995. He said, 30 years of clean returns. He said, no discrepancies. He said, no errors. He said perfect record keeping. I asked about the $15,000 donation. Tom laughed. Short. Sharp. He said that donation is completely legitimate. He said it's properly documented. He said it's well within your means. He said anyone questioning it doesn't understand basic accounting. He said I'll testify. He said I'll bring the records. He said we'll show them exactly how sound your financial management is. 3 witnesses now. 3 people willing to stand up in court and say I was competent, capable, deserving of autonomy. The coffee had gone cold. Morning light filtered through the kitchen window. Weak. Gray. November in New England. The trees outside were bare. Winter coming. The doorbell rang at 9:15. Unexpected. I wasn't expecting anyone. Mrs. Chen stood on the porch. Not Dr. Patricia Chen. Mrs. Chen from next door. The one who'd reported my car running in the driveway. She wore a blue cardigan. Sensible shoes. Her hands twisted together nervously. She said, Mrs. Walker. She said I need to talk to you. She said, may I come in? The living room felt formal with her in it. She sat on the edge of the sofa. Perched. Ready to flee. She said I heard about the court case. She said I heard your daughter is trying to get conservatorship. I said yes. I said that's correct. I waited for whatever came next. Mrs. Chen looked at her hands. She said they came to talk to me. She said your daughter and her husband. She said they asked me questions about you. She said about your behavior. She said about any concerns I had. My chest tightened. Mrs. Chen was one of their witnesses. The neighbor who'd seen something wrong. Evidence of decline. She said I told them about the car. She said about it running in the driveway that morning in February. She said I told them I was worried you'd forgotten it was on. The memory came back sharp. February 14th. 12 degrees. Ice on the windshield. 20 minutes of defrosting before I could drive safely. Mrs. Chen continued. She said but I didn't tell them the whole story. She said I didn't tell them you came out after 20 minutes. She said I didn't tell them you scraped the ice carefully. She said I didn't tell them you drove away perfectly fine. She looked up at me. Her eyes were wet. She said they only wanted to hear the first part. She said the part that made you look confused. She said they didn't want context. I asked why she was telling me this. Mrs. Chen straightened. She said because it's not right. She said I've lived next to you for 15 years. She said you've never been anything but responsible. She said I told them what they wanted to hear. She said but I shouldn't have. She said I want to tell the truth. She said I want to testify for you. She said if you'll let me. The clock ticked on the mantel. Robert's photograph watched from the wall. The room was very quiet. I said yes. I said I would appreciate that. I said thank you. Mrs. Chen stood. She said I'm sorry. She said I should have been more careful with my words. She said your daughter made it sound like she was just concerned. She said I didn't realize what she was really doing. After she left, the house felt different. Lighter somehow. 4 witnesses now. 4 people willing to tell the truth. The phone rang at 11. Rachel. She said I've been making calls. She said we have good support building. She said Dr. Chen's letter came through. She said it's strong. She said very strong. I told her about Mrs. Chen. About the neighbor coming forward. About the context that Linda had deliberately omitted. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then she said that's good. She said that's very good. She said it shows a pattern. She said it shows they're manipulating evidence. She said Margaret, we have 9 days until the hearing. She said we need to keep building. She said every piece of evidence matters. She said every witness counts. 9 days. 216 hours. 12,960 minutes until a judge decided if I was competent enough to live my own life. I said I understand. I said what do we do next? Rachel said we prepare. She said we document everything. She said we build an undeniable case. She said and Margaret. She said we fight. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Monday morning. 7 days until the hearing. Rain drummed against the kitchen window. Steady, cold, the kind of November rain that promised winter. Rachel had called Sunday night. She'd said we need to meet. She'd said they filed additional evidence. She'd said come to the office at 9. The drive downtown took 40 minutes. Traffic was heavy. Brake lights glowed red through the rain. Windshield wipers swept back and forth. Rhythmic, hypnotic. The radio played news I didn't listen to. Rachel's office felt smaller this time. More crowded. Papers covered every surface. Legal briefs, medical records, bank statements, the architecture of my defense. She slid a document across the desk. New pages, fresh ink. She said this came Friday afternoon. She said Linda's attorney filed a supplemental petition. She said read it. The document was 12 pages long. New allegations, new evidence, new reasons why Margaret Walker couldn't be trusted with her own life. Page 3 detailed the refrigerator purchase. January 15, $2,800. The petition called it impulsive, unnecessary, evidence of poor judgment. The old refrigerator had been functional, they claimed. The purchase was wasteful. The old refrigerator had been 32 years old. The compressor was failing. The freezer door wouldn't seal. I'd replaced it before it died completely. That was planning. That was good judgment. Page 5 discussed my driving record. A speeding ticket from 3 years ago. 47 in a 40 zone. The petition called it reckless. Evidence of declining awareness. Dangerous behavior. Everyone got speeding tickets. 47 in a 40 was barely speeding. This was grasping at straws. But straws could win cases. Page 8 was worse. Much worse. The petition included a statement from Dr. Howard Walsh, a psychiatrist I'd never met. He'd reviewed my case file remotely. He'd examined the evidence Linda provided. He'd concluded I showed signs of diminished capacity. Possible early cognitive decline. Recommendation for full neuropsychological evaluation and protective oversight. A diagnosis without an examination. A professional opinion bought and paid for by my daughter. Rachel said this is a problem. She said Walsh has credibility. She said he's testified in dozens of conservatorship cases. She said judges listen to him. I asked if he could do that. Issue an opinion without meeting me. Rachel said technically yes. She said he's basing it on documented evidence. She said Linda gave him everything. She said the car incident. She said the $15,000 donation. She said the refrigerator purchase. She said taken together, it builds a narrative. Narrative. The story was more important than truth. The appearance of decline mattered more than the reality of competence. Rachel leaned forward. She said we need our own expert. She said we need a psychiatrist who will examine you properly. She said we need someone who can counter Walsh's opinion. She said I have someone in mind. She said Dr. Elizabeth Morse. She said she's done this before. She said she's good. She said can you see her today? The appointment was at 2 o'clock. Dr. Morse's office was in Cambridge. Red brick building. 4th floor. The waiting room smelled of lavender and old carpet. Dr. Morse was 60. Gray hair cut short. Sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She shook my hand firmly. She said, "Mrs. Walker." She said, "Let's talk." Her office was warm, comfortable. Books lined the walls. Medical texts. Psychology journals. A small photograph of a golden retriever sat on her desk. She said, "I've reviewed Dr. Walsh's statement." She said, "I've read the petition." She said, "Now I want to hear from you." She said, "Tell me about your life." The question felt enormous. Tell me about your life. 70 years compressed into a single answer. I started with the basics. Married at 23. One daughter. Widow for 5 years. Living independently. Managing my own household. Making my own decisions. Dr. Morse took notes. She said, "Tell me about a typical day." She said, "Walk me through it." She said, "What time you wake up." She said, "What you do." She said, "How you spend your time." 6:30 wake up. Coffee. Breakfast. Morning news. Errands or housework. Lunch. Reading. Sometimes gardening when weather permitted. Dinner. Television. Bed by 10:30. The routine of a competent life. She asked about medications. I listed them. Blood pressure. Cholesterol. Thyroid supplement. She asked who managed them. I said I do. She asked if I ever missed doses. I said no, never. She asked about finances. I explained the budgeting system. The checkbook balanced weekly. Bills paid on the 1st and 15th. Savings allocated monthly. Everything documented. Everything tracked. She asked about the $15,000 donation. I explained the Veterans Housing Fund. The research I'd done. The tax deduction. The deliberate decision to give money to people who needed it. Dr. Morse stopped writing. She looked at me directly. She said, "Mrs. Walker, do you know why you're here?" I said yes. I said, "My daughter thinks I'm incompetent." I said, "She wants control of my life." She said, "Do you think you're incompetent?" I said no. I said, "Absolutely not." She said, "Why do you think your daughter is doing this?" The question hung in the air. Heavy. Complicated. True answers were rarely simple. I said, "I think she wants my house." I said, "I think she needs money." I said, "I think she's been planning this for a while." Dr. Morse nodded slowly. She said, "That's a painful thing to believe about your own child." I said yes. I said it is. The evaluation continued for 2 hours. Memory tests. Problem-solving exercises. Questions about mood and sleep and daily functioning. Everything measured. Everything assessed. Everything documented properly this time. When we finished, Dr. Morse put down her pen. She said, "Mrs. Walker, I see no evidence of cognitive decline." She said, "Your memory is excellent." She said, "Your judgment is sound." She said, "You demonstrate clear capacity for independent living." She said, "I'll write a report stating exactly that." She said, "It will counter Dr. Walsh's opinion." She said, "It will be ready by Thursday." She said, "In time for the hearing." The rain had stopped when I left her office. The streets were wet. Reflective. City lights doubled on the pavement. Rush hour traffic crawled past. My phone buzzed. A text from Linda. The first contact since that Tuesday dinner. Since the petition was filed. Since my daughter decided I was incompetent. The message was short. Clinical. She said, "We need to talk." She said, "This doesn't have to be adversarial." She said, "We can work something out." She said, "Call me." Work something out. Translation, give up. Agree to the conservatorship. Make this easy for everyone. I deleted the message. No response needed. We would talk in court. With a judge present. With lawyers and witnesses and evidence. That was where we would work things out. The drive home took an hour. Traffic. Rain. Monday evening in Boston. The house was dark when I arrived. Empty. Quiet. I turned on lights. Kitchen first. Then living room. Then hallway. Pushing back the darkness. Claiming space. 7 days until the hearing. 168 hours. 10,080 minutes. Rachel called at 8. She said I heard from Dr. Morse. She said the evaluation went well. She said her report will help significantly. I asked if it was enough. Rachel was quiet for a moment. She said it's stronger than it was this morning. She said we have good witnesses. She said we have solid evidence. She said but conservatorship cases are unpredictable. She said judges have broad discretion. Broad discretion. Legal language for uncertainty. For risk. For the possibility that 7 days from now I would lose everything. Rachel said get some rest. She said we have more work this week. She said depositions on Wednesday. She said final prep on Friday. She said then we go to court. She said Margaret. She said we're ready. She said as ready as we can be. I said thank you. I said I'll see you Wednesday. The house settled into night silence. Furnace clicking. Wind outside. Normal sounds. The sounds of a home I'd lived in for 47 years. 7 more days. Then we'd see if it was still mine. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Wednesday morning. 5 days until the hearing. The deposition was scheduled for 10 o'clock at Linda's attorney's office. Downtown Boston. 18th floor. Windows overlooking the harbor. Rachel drove. She said depositions are discovery. She said they'll ask you questions under oath. She said answer truthfully but briefly. She said don't volunteer extra information. She said stay calm no matter what they ask. The law firm was expensive. Polished marble floors. Original artwork on the walls. Leather furniture in the waiting area. Linda's attorney specialized in elder law. Conservatorships. Estate planning. Taking control of other people's lives. His name was Richard Brennan. 55. Silver hair. Expensive suit. The kind of lawyer who made his living off family conflicts. He shook my hand with practiced sympathy. He said Mrs. Walker. He said thank you for coming. He said this shouldn't take long. The conference room was cold. Air conditioning too high. A court reporter sat in the corner. Fingers poised over the stenography machine. Everything I said would be recorded. Transcribed. Used as evidence. Linda sat across the table. She wore a navy dress. Pearl necklace. Hair perfect. She looked like she was attending a charity luncheon. Not destroying her mother's autonomy. Our eyes met briefly. She looked away first. Brennan started with basic questions. Name. Age. Address. How long I'd lived there. Marital status. When Robert died. All information he already had. Warming up. Building a record. Then the questions sharpened. He asked about the refrigerator purchase. Why I'd bought it. Whether I'd consulted anyone. Whether I'd compared prices. Whether I thought it was necessary. I said the old refrigerator was 32 years old. I said the compressor was failing. I said I researched models online. I said I bought a mid-range option. I said it was a reasonable purchase for a necessary appliance. Brennan made notes. He said but you didn't discuss it with anyone. He said you made this decision alone. I said yes. I said it's my house. I said it's my refrigerator. I said I'm capable of making that decision. He asked about the car incident. February 14th. The car running in the driveway. Whether I'd forgotten it was on. Whether I'd been confused. I said no. I said I was defrosting the windshield. I said it was 12 degrees. I said I let it run for 20 minutes. I said then I drove to the grocery store safely. Brennan said but your neighbor was concerned. He said she reported unusual behavior. I said she misunderstood the situation. I said there was nothing unusual about warming up a car in winter. The questions continued, each one designed to make normal behavior sound questionable. Each answer recorded, each response analyzed for signs of decline. He asked about my daily routine. I described it. Morning coffee, household tasks, errands, reading. He asked if I ever felt confused. I said no. He asked if I ever forgot appointments. I said no. He asked if I ever had trouble managing my medications. I said no, never. He asked about loneliness, whether I missed having family around, whether living alone was difficult, whether I ever felt I needed help. The subtext was clear. Lonely old woman, living alone, making poor choices, needing intervention. I said I choose to live independently. I said I'm comfortable alone. I said I manage my household successfully. I said I don't need or want help. Brennan leaned forward. He said but Mrs. Walker, wouldn't it be easier? He said wouldn't it be safer to have someone looking after you? He said your daughter is just concerned. He said she wants what's best for you. Rachel interrupted. She said that's not a question. She said it's a statement. She said move on. Brennan smiled. Thin. Professional. He said of course. He asked about the $15,000 donation. The Veterans Housing Fund. Why that charity? Why that amount? Whether I'd researched it properly. I said I'd spent 2 weeks researching veterans' charities. I said I'd reviewed their tax filings. I said I'd verified their legitimacy. I said I made an informed decision to donate money I could afford to give. He said but $15,000 is substantial. He said most people would consult family before making such a donation. He said did you discuss it with Linda? I said no. I said it's my money. I said I don't need permission to donate it. Brennan made more notes. He said but you can see how it might concern your family. He said large unusual expenditures. He said decisions made without consultation. He said it raises questions about judgment. Rachel said objection. She said my client's judgment is not on trial here. She said her competence is. She said there's a difference. Brennan said the two are related. Rachel said prove it. The room went quiet. Brennan changed tactics. He asked about Robert. How long we'd been married. How he'd died. Whether I'd struggled after his death. 47 years married. Heart attack. Home hospice care. I'd been with him when he died. Holding his hand. 5 years ago now. He asked if I'd been depressed afterward. I said I'd been grieving. I said there's a difference. He asked if I'd seen a therapist. I said no. He asked if I'd taken any medication for depression. I said no. He said so you went through a major loss without any professional support. He said that must have been difficult. He said do you think that might have affected your decision-making? I looked at Linda. She was studying her hands. Avoiding my eyes. This was her attorney. Her strategy. Her attack. I said losing my husband was the hardest thing I've ever experienced. I said but it didn't make me incompetent. I said grief doesn't equal incapacity. I said I've continued to function. I said I've managed my life successfully. I said I'm still the same person I was before Robert died. Brennan asked if I thought Linda was trying to hurt me. I said I think she's trying to control me. He asked why I thought that. I said because she filed for conservatorship. I said the evidence speaks for itself. He asked if we'd had conflicts before. I said normal mother-daughter disagreements. Nothing significant. He asked when things changed. I said when she started talking about my house being too big. I said when she started suggesting assisted living. I said when she started questioning my choices. He asked when that was. I said about 8 months ago. Last March. After she and Mark refinanced their house. After their property taxes went up. After they realized they were overextended financially. Rachel touched my arm. Light. Warning. Don't speculate about motives. Just facts. Brennan said, so you believe this is about money? I said I believe the timing is interesting. I said I believe the evidence suggests financial motivation. I said but you'd have to ask Linda about that. He said I'm asking you. I said I've answered your question. The deposition lasted 3 hours. By the end, the room felt smaller. Colder. The court reporter's fingers had never stopped moving. Every word recorded. Every answer preserved. Brennan said that's all I have. He said thank you for your time. He said we'll see you Monday. Monday. The hearing. 5 days away. Linda stood to leave. She looked at me. She said, Mom. She said we should talk. She said this doesn't have to be like this. Rachel said no contact. She said all communication goes through me. She said those are the rules. Linda's face hardened. She said fine. She said see you in court then. She walked out. Door closing firmly behind her. Rachel gathered papers. She said you did well. She said you stayed calm. She said your answers were good. She said clear and consistent. I asked if it was enough. Rachel said it helps. She said they didn't trip you up. She said they didn't get anything they can use against you. She said now we wait. She said 5 more days. She said then we present our case. The elevator descended. 18 floors back to ground level. Back to the street. Back to my car and my house and my independent life. 5 more days to keep it. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Friday morning. 3 days until the hearing. Rachel's office at 9 for final preparation. The city was waking up. Traffic sounds. Car horns. Footsteps on sidewalks. Normal life continuing while mine hung in balance. Rachel had everything organized. Witness statements in blue folders. Medical records in red. Financial documents in green. Color-coded evidence of my competence. She said we go through everything today. She said I need you to know exactly what to expect Monday. She said no surprises. Dr. Morse's report sat on top. 15 pages. Professional letterhead. Her conclusions were clear. No evidence of cognitive impairment. Memory function within normal limits for age. Judgment intact. Capacity for independent living fully demonstrated. Rachel said this is strong. She said it directly contradicts Walsh's opinion. She said Morse actually examined you. She said that matters. Tom Bradley's financial statement was next. 30 years of tax returns. Every year filed on time. Every deduction legitimate. Every number accurate. His letter stated unequivocally that I demonstrated sound financial management. No evidence of confusion or poor judgment. Dr. Patricia Chen's medical evaluation followed. 12 years as my physician. Complete cognitive assessment. Blood work. Physical examination. Her conclusion, patient is in excellent health for her age. Fully capable of independent living. No medical justification for conservatorship. The pharmacy records showed 8 years of perfect medication compliance. Never late. Never confused. Never any issues. Bank statements demonstrated consistent, careful money management. Bills paid on schedule. Savings maintained. No overdrafts. No unusual patterns except for reasonable, documented expenditures. Rachel said this is good evidence. She said very good. She said but we need to prepare for their counter-arguments. She opened Linda's petition file. She said they'll focus on the car incident. She said they'll emphasize the neighbor's concern. She said they'll make it sound irresponsible. I said it was 20 minutes in February. I said I was defrosting ice. Rachel said I know. She said but they'll frame it differently. She said absent-minded elderly woman. She said car running unattended. She said potential danger. She said when they bring this up, stay calm. She said explain the context clearly. She said temperature. She said ice. She said deliberate choice. She said make the judge see you were being careful, not careless. Next was the $15,000 donation. Rachel said they'll call it impulsive. She said they'll say it shows poor judgment. She said they'll emphasize you didn't consult anyone. I said I researched for 2 weeks. I said I verified the charity's legitimacy. I said I made an informed decision. Rachel said exactly. She said that's what you tell the judge. She said research. She said verification. She said informed decision. She said those are the key words. The refrigerator purchase was easier to defend. Rachel said appliances fail. She said replacement is normal maintenance. She said this one is weak for them. She said but they'll still mention it. She said part of building the pattern. She asked about Dr. Walsh. Whether I understood his role. I said he diagnosed me without meeting me. Rachel said yes. She said that's their expert witness. She said he'll testify Monday. She said he'll say you show signs of diminished capacity. She said when he testifies, stay neutral. She said don't react. She said don't show emotion. She said we'll cross-examine him. She said we'll expose the weakness of a remote diagnosis. The afternoon was for witness preparation. Father Michael arrived at 2. He wore his clerical collar. Black shirt. White tab. He shook my hand warmly. Rachel went through his testimony. She said tell the judge how long you've known Mrs. Walker. She said describe her attendance. She said speak to her character. She said her reliability. Father Michael said 43 years. She said never missed Christmas or Easter. She said always punctual. She said always appropriate. She said always fully present and engaged. Rachel said good. She said keep it simple. She said facts not feelings. She said the judge needs concrete examples. Susan Park came at 3. She brought a folder of library records. 12 years of volunteer logs. Every shift documented. Every task completed. She said these show Margaret's consistency. She said her reliability. She said her competence. Rachel reviewed her testimony. She said describe the work Mrs. Walker did. She said emphasize organization. She said emphasize responsibility. She said emphasize independent decision-making. Susan said Margaret managed our entire donation system. She said she cataloged books. She said she trained new volunteers. She said she handled complex organizational tasks. She said she did it perfectly for 12 years. Tom Bradley arrived at 4. He carried a briefcase full of tax returns. He said 30 years of clean records. He said not one error. He said not one audit. He said that's the definition of competent financial management. Rachel said when they ask about the $15,000 donation, what do you say? Tom said I say it's properly documented. He said I say it's within her means. He said I say it's completely appropriate. He said I say anyone questioning it doesn't understand basic accounting. Rachel smiled. She said perfect. She said exactly like that. Mrs. Chen came last. 5 o'clock. She looked nervous. Hands twisting. She said I've never testified before. She said I don't know what to expect. Rachel said just tell the truth. She said tell what you saw. She said tell the full story, not just the part Linda wanted to hear. Mrs. Chen said the car was running. She said I was concerned initially. She said but then Margaret came out. She said she scraped the ice carefully. She said she drove away normally. She said there was nothing wrong. She said I should have told Linda that. Rachel said you'll tell the judge. She said that's what matters now. After everyone left, Rachel and I sat in the quiet office. Outside, the city was settling into evening. Street lights coming on. Office buildings emptying. Friday night beginning. Rachel said you have good witnesses. She said you have strong evidence. She said we've built a solid case. She said but I need you to understand something. She said conservatorship hearings are unpredictable. She said judges have broad discretion. She said even with everything we have, there's risk. I said what are our chances? Rachel was quiet for a moment. She said honestly. She said I think we're strong. She said I think we win. She said but I can't guarantee it. She said nothing is certain until the judge rules. She said Judge Morrison is fair. She said he follows the evidence. She said he doesn't jump to conclusions. She said that works in our favor. She said but he's also cautious. She said he'd rather protect someone unnecessarily than risk someone who needs help. She said that's the challenge. She said proving you don't need protection. I asked what happens if we lose. Rachel said Linda becomes conservator. She said she controls your finances. She said she makes medical decisions. She said she can decide where you live. She said you lose autonomy. She said but we can appeal. She said if we lose Monday, we file immediately. She said we take it to a higher court. She said we keep fighting. The office felt very quiet. The weight of Monday pressing down. 3 more days. 72 hours. 4,320 minutes until a judge decided my fate. Rachel said go home. She said rest this weekend. She said don't think about this constantly. She said you've done everything you can. She said now we wait for Monday. She walked me to the elevator. She said Margaret. She said you're one of the most capable people I know. She said that judge will see it. She said I'm sure of it. The elevator descended. Floors ticking past. Descending back to ground level. Back to the parking garage. Back to my car. 3 more days of freedom. Then Monday. Then the courtroom. Then the ruling that would determine whether 70 years of competent living mattered at all. The weekend stretched ahead. Saturday. Sunday. 2 days to prepare for the fight of my life. I drove home through Friday evening traffic. Slow. Steady. Careful. Like everything else I did. Like everything I'd been doing for 70 years. Competent. Capable. Independent. Monday would prove it. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Monday morning. The hearing. 6:30 wake up. Coffee tasted like metal. Hands steady on the cup. No tremor. No weakness. Just the weight of what today meant. Navy suit. Pearl earrings. The same outfit I'd worn to Robert's funeral. Armor for impossible days. Rachel picked me up at 8. She said you look perfect. She said calm and professional. She said exactly right. The drive downtown took 30 minutes. Neither of us spoke much. Words felt unnecessary. Suffolk County Probate Court. Gray stone building. Heavy doors. Security checkpoint. Metal detector. My purse searched. Then elevator to the 4th floor. Courtroom 4C. Judge Morrison presiding. The hallway outside smelled of floor wax and old paper. Legal anxiety. Linda sat on a bench with Mark and Brennan. She wore cream. Expensive. Her armor looked softer than mine. More sympathetic. Our eyes met. She looked away. Again. Rachel said don't engage. She said stay focused. She said we go in at 9. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling. Fluorescent lights. Rows of benches like church pews. The judge's bench elevated, looking down on everyone. Judge Morrison was 68. Gray beard. Reading glasses on a chain. He'd been on the bench for 23 years. Rachel had researched him thoroughly. Fair but cautious. Evidence-based. Thorough. The bailiff called us to order. Everyone stood. The judge entered. Black robes. Measured steps. He sat. We sat. The machinery of justice beginning. Brennan presented Linda's case first. He called it a matter of protection. Of concern. Of family responsibility. He said Margaret Walker is 70 years old. He said she lives alone. He said she's making questionable decisions. He said her family is worried. He said intervention is necessary for her own safety. The words floated across the courtroom. Clinical. Detached. Making my life sound like a problem requiring solution. Brennan called his first witness. Dr. Howard Walsh, the psychiatrist who'd never met me. He took the stand. Sworn in. Hand on Bible. Truth and nothing but. Walsh was 55. Confident. Professional. He said he'd reviewed the case materials thoroughly. He said he'd examined the evidence. He said the pattern was concerning. Brennan asked what pattern. Walsh said elderly woman living alone. He said significant financial decisions without consultation. He said the car incident suggesting possible absent-mindedness. He said these factors together raised red flags. He said they suggested diminished capacity. He said early cognitive decline was possible. Possible. The word did heavy work. No certainty, just possibility. Just enough doubt to justify intervention. Rachel cross-examined. She said, Dr. Walsh, you never met Mrs. Walker. He said that's correct. She said you never examined her. He said I reviewed comprehensive documentation. Rachel said but you never spoke to her. Never tested her memory. Never assessed her directly. Walsh shifted slightly. He said remote evaluation is accepted practice. Rachel said is it best practice? Walsh said it depends on the circumstances. Rachel said so you issued a professional opinion about cognitive decline without ever meeting the patient. Walsh said I based my opinion on documented evidence. Rachel said documented by whom? Walsh said by family members and neighbors who observed concerning behavior. Rachel said observed or interpreted. Walsh hesitated. She said, Dr. Walsh, isn't it true that the same evidence could be interpreted differently with proper context? He said potentially. She said thank you. She said no further questions. Brennan called Mrs. Chen next. My neighbor. She looked uncomfortable on the stand. She testified about the car running in the driveway. She said it concerned her. She said it ran for a long time. Rachel asked how long. Mrs. Chen said 20 minutes maybe. Rachel asked what the temperature was that day. Mrs. Chen said very cold. Below freezing. Rachel asked if Mrs. Chen herself had ever warmed up her car on cold mornings. Mrs. Chen said yes. Rachel asked for how long. Mrs. Chen said 15 or 20 minutes usually. Rachel said so Mrs. Walker was doing exactly what you do yourself on cold mornings. Mrs. Chen said I suppose so. Rachel said and you saw her come out, scrape the ice, and drive away safely. Mrs. Chen said yes. Rachel said so there was nothing actually wrong with her behavior. Mrs. Chen said no, not when I think about it that way. Brennan looked less confident. His case was unraveling. Context-destroying narrative. Linda testified next. My daughter. On the stand. Under oath. She said she was worried. She said I'd been making poor choices. She said the $15,000 donation concerned her. She said I hadn't discussed it with family. Rachel asked why Linda expected to be consulted about my financial decisions. Linda said because I'm her daughter. She said because I care about her welfare. Rachel said but Mrs. Walker is competent to manage her own finances. Linda said I have concerns about her judgment. Rachel asked what specifically concerned her. Linda said the donation was impulsive. Rachel said how do you know it was impulsive? Linda said because she didn't tell me about it first. Rachel let that sit. She said Mrs. Walker is 70 years old. She said she's been managing money successfully for 50 years. She said why would she need your permission to donate her own money? Linda said I didn't say permission. She said I said consultation. Rachel said but you filed for conservatorship. She said that's more than consultation. She said that's control. Linda's face flushed. She said I'm trying to protect my mother. Rachel said from what? Linda didn't answer. Rachel called our witnesses. Father Michael testified about 43 years of consistent attendance. Punctual. Appropriate. Fully engaged. No signs of confusion or decline. Susan Park described 12 years of volunteer work. Complex organizational tasks. Perfect execution. Reliable. Competent. Capable. Tom Bradley presented 30 years of financial records. Clean. Accurate. No errors. He said the $15,000 donation was properly documented and completely appropriate. He said questioning it showed financial ignorance, not evidence of incompetence. Dr. Patricia Chen testified about 12 years as my physician. She said my cognitive assessment was perfect. She said my health was excellent. She said there was no medical justification for conservatorship. Dr. Elizabeth Morse presented her evaluation. 2 hours of comprehensive testing. Memory excellent. Judgment sound. Decision-making capacity fully intact. She said I showed no signs of cognitive decline. She said I demonstrated clear competence for independent living. The evidence stacked up. Witness after witness. Document after document. The architecture of my defense. Then Judge Morrison asked me to testify. The bailiff swore me in. Rachel said tell the judge about your daily life. About your routine. About your independence. I described my days. Morning coffee. Household management. Bill paying. Medication management. Driving. Shopping. Decision-making. Living. Just living. Competently. Independently. Successfully. Brennan cross-examined. He asked if I was lonely. I said no. He asked if I ever felt overwhelmed. I said no. He asked if I understood my daughter was concerned. I said I understand she filed for conservatorship. I said I understand she wants control of my life. I said I don't understand why she thinks I need it. He said don't you think having help would make things easier? I said easier isn't the point. I said capable is the point. I said I am capable. I said I choose independence. I said that choice should be respected. Closing arguments were brief. Brennan said the court should err on caution. Rachel said the court should err on freedom. Judge Morrison said he'd review the evidence. He said he'd issue his ruling by end of day. He said court adjourned. The courtroom emptied. Rachel and I stood in the hallway. She said we did everything we could. She said now we wait. Linda walked past. She said Mom. I didn't respond. She left with Mark and Brennan. Gone. The afternoon was endless. Waiting. Rachel's office. Coffee growing cold. Clock ticking. Phone silent. At 4:30 it rang. Rachel answered. She listened. She said thank you. She hung up. She looked at me. She said Judge Morrison ruled. She said petition denied. She said you remain independent. She said you won. The words took a moment to land. Won. Freedom. Autonomy. Mine still. Rachel said he found no evidence supporting conservatorship. She said your competence was clearly demonstrated. She said Linda's petition was without merit. I asked what happens now. Rachel said you go home. She said you live your life. She said exactly as you have been. She said Margaret. She said you fought for yourself. She said you won. The drive home was quiet. Evening traffic. Lights coming on. City settling into night. Normal Monday evening. Except everything had changed. Or nothing had. I was still me. Still independent. Still free. The house was dark when I arrived. I turned on lights. Kitchen. Living room. Hallway. My house. My choices. My life. Robert's photograph watched from the wall. 5 years gone. I said it out loud. I said I did it. I said I kept it. I said our home. Our life. Still mine. The phone rang at 7. Rachel. She said congratulations again. She said rest well tonight. She said you earned it. After she hung up, silence filled the house. Good silence. Free silence. The sound of a life still my own. 70 years old. Living alone. Making my own decisions. Exactly as it should be.